The United Kingdom prides itself on its commitment to justice and the protection of its citizens. Yet beneath the surface of this seemingly civilized society, a dark and sinister reality has festered for decades. Child grooming gangs operating with chilling impunity have preyed on vulnerable young girls, often from disadvantaged backgrounds. Their crimes, often hidden in plain sight, represent a betrayal of the most vulnerable by the very institutions tasked with their protection. This is the untold story of their suffering, the systemic failures that allowed these abuses to flourish, and the fight for justice that continues to this day. For years, the issue of child grooming gangs remained largely hidden from public view, shrouded in a culture of silence and denial. Victims, often terrified and traumatized, were too afraid to come forward. Those who did were often ignored or disbelieved by the authorities who should have protected them. The perpetrators, emboldened by their seeming invincibility, continued their reign of terror, leaving countless lives shattered in their wake. The emergence of these gangs can be traced back to a confluence of factors, including societal inequalities, cultural taboos, and a failure of law enforcement to address the issue in its early stages. The victims, often from broken homes or in care, were seen as easy targets, their vulnerabilities ruthlessly exploited by predators who operated with chilling calculation. The perpetrators, often from minority ethnic backgrounds, used their cultural differences as a shield, exploiting the sensitivities surrounding race and religion to silence their critics and deter investigation. The failure of authorities to effectively address this issue is a stain on the conscience of the nation. Police forces, hampered by a misguided sense of political correctness and a fear of being labeled racist, often turned a blind eye to the abuse. Social services, overwhelmed and under-resourced, missed crucial warning signs, leaving vulnerable children at the mercy of their abusers. The result was a catastrophic failure of safeguarding, allowing the abuse to continue unchecked for years. The roots of the grooming gang phenomenon in the UK run deep, stretching back decades. While the issue gained significant public attention in the early 2000s, cases of organized child sexual exploitation have been documented as early as the 1980s. These early cases, often involving young girls in care, exposed the vulnerability of children within the system and the predatory nature of some individuals seeking to exploit them. One of the most disturbing aspects of the grooming gang phenomenon is the organized and calculated manner in which these groups operate. They often target specific communities or neighborhoods, identifying and grooming vulnerable girls over extended periods. The perpetrators use a combination of psychological manipulation, intimidation, and violence to control their victims, often plying them with drugs and alcohol and using threats against their families to ensure their silence. The early cases of grooming gangs often went unreported or were met with indifference by authorities. There was a reluctance to acknowledge the issue, perhaps fueled by a fear of inflaming racial tensions or appearing culturally insensitive. This reluctance to act, however, allowed the problem to fester and grow, creating a climate of impunity that emboldened perpetrators and left countless victims suffering in silence. It wasn't until the turn of the century that the issue of grooming gangs began to receive wider public attention. High-profile cases, such as the Rochdale scandal in 2012, exposed the horrifying scale of the abuse and the systemic failures that allowed it to occur. The Rochdale case, involving the systematic abuse of dozens of young girls by a group of men predominantly of Pakistani heritage, shattered the silence surrounding the issue and sparked a national outcry. The town of Rotherham, South Yorkshire, became synonymous with the horrors of child grooming gangs when a series of devastating reports revealed the true extent of the abuse that had taken place there. An independent inquiry commissioned in 2013 estimated that at least 1,400 children had been sexually exploited in Rotherham between 1997 and 2013. The report painted a grim picture of systemic failures by local authorities who were accused of ignoring the abuse for fear of being labelled racist. The Rotherham scandal sent shockwaves through the nation, exposing the deep-seated failings that had allowed such widespread abuse to occur. The inquiry found that victims, many of whom were from disadvantaged backgrounds, were often disbelieved by police and social workers. Their abusers, predominantly men of Pakistani heritage, were often treated with leniency, their crimes minimized or excused as a cultural norm. The report highlighted the toxic combination of factors that contributed to the scandal, including a culture of fear and intimidation within the local community, a lack of awareness and training among professionals, and a systemic reluctance to address the issue of race and ethnicity in the context of child sexual exploitation. The Rotherham scandal became a stark reminder of the dangers of political correctness and the devastating consequences of ignoring uncomfortable truths. The revelations from Rotherham sparked a national debate about the nature and scale of child grooming gangs in the UK. It forced authorities across the country to confront their own failings and re-examine their approaches to tackling child sexual exploitation. The scandal led to a number of high-profile investigations and inquiries, as well as the establishment of the Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse, a wide-ranging inquiry tasked with examining institutional failings in relation to child abuse. In the face of escalating violence, the police's response has been, well, less than adequate. Many communities feel abandoned, their pleas for help met with silence. Fear grows as trust in law enforcement erodes. It's a troubling cycle, one that leaves citizens vulnerable and desperate for solutions. In many instances, the path to justice seems obstructed by complex legal systems and bureaucratic red tape. Victims and their families often find themselves lost in a maze of procedures and paperwork. The question arises, is the system designed to protect the innocent, or does it inadvertently shield the guilty? As news of these barriers spreads, public outrage grows. Communities demand transparency and accountability from those in power. Protests erupt, voices rise, and the call for justice becomes impossible to ignore. People are no longer willing to accept the status quo. They want change, and they want it now. In response to the outcry, efforts for systemic reform begin to take shape. Lawmakers, activists, and community leaders come together to address the flaws in the system. Community engagement becomes a cornerstone of these efforts, as the voices of those affected are finally heard and valued. Real change starts with understanding and collaboration. Amidst the turmoil, a call for justice rings louder than ever. It is a plea for hope, a desire for a future where fairness and equality prevail. The journey is far from over, but with continued effort and unwavering resolve, there is a path forward. Together, we can build a society where justice is not just an ideal, but a reality for all.